Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sony E 15mm f1.4G, a wide prime lens designed for Sony's mirrorless cameras with cropped APS-C sensors. Mount it on models like the ZV-E10 or A6000 series, and it'll deliver coverage equivalent to 22.5mm on full frame, making it ideal for landscape, architecture, and presenting pieces to camera. Announced in June 2022 and costing between $700 and $800, it's launched alongside two other new wide lenses. Yep, you wait 3 years for a new Sony APS-C lens to come out, and then 3 come along at once. So from left to right, here's the 10-20 f4G power zoom, the 11mm 1.8, and the 15mm 1.4G. Sony loaned me all 3 to test, and while this particular review concentrates on the 15, I also have separate reviews of the other 2 here. Check the links below for the latest UK and US pricing. While the 15 1.4 is unique in Sony's catalogue, it goes up against a couple of third-party options, most obviously the Sigma 16mm 1.4 launched 4.5 years previously and comfortably cheaper at around $400. To a lesser extent, there's the slightly wider but equally affordable Viltrox 13mm 1.4, currently available in Fujifilm's X-mount at the time I made this review, but I reckon fairly likely to arrive for E-mount before too long. Sony's new 15 is fairly compact, measuring 69 by 65mm and weighing just 220 grams. You'll barely notice it mounted on one of Sony's light APS-C bodies, making it an ideal walk-around option. There's a 55mm filter thread, and the lens is sealed against dust and moisture, including a rubber grommet at the mount. Sony also includes a petal hood with the lens. Contrast its size with the Sigma 16mm 1.4 looking relatively hefty here at 92 by 72mm and weighing almost double at 405 grams. Place them side by side and the new Sony is clearly much better suited to the smaller APS-C bodies. In terms of controls, there's a free spinning manual focusing ring that feels a little smoother than the cheaper 11mm 1.8 model, but like that lens operates with linear response. Alongside is a dedicated aperture ring running between f1.4 and f16 with an A position for body-based control. The ring operates in 1/3 EV increments, but a switch on the side of the barrel can declick it for smooth and silent adjustments, often preferred in video. There's also a customizable focus hold button and a switch for auto manual focus. Overall, the design is a lot busier than the Sigma 16 1.4, whose only control is a generously wide manual focusing ring. Okay, so here's the Sony 15 1.4 mounted on a ZV-E10, autofocusing using AFS and a single AF area in the middle with the aperture wide open to 1.4, where you can see it's pretty quick and reasonably confident. It's also essentially silent in operation. Note, you can feel the internal focusing group move a little on all 3 of Sony's new wide lenses if you shake them while the camera's powered down or the lens isn't mounted, but they become locked in place when it's switched on. For comparison, here's the Sigma 16 1.4 DGDN, again at 1.4 on the ZV-E10, and you can see the focusing speed in AFS mode is visibly slower with a tiny wobble at the end to confirm. Let's now switch to the same test but for movie autofocus, this time with the Sony 15 1.4 on the ZV-E10 body, now in continuous AFC mode, where you can see the transitions are quick, albeit often aided with a mild wobble to confirm at each end. And now for the same test with the Sigma, again at 1.4 and suffering from an even more obvious wobble to confirm at each end. I wonder if this was an issue with the ZV-E10 body I had on test. But either way, while neither was immune to the confirmation wobble, the Sony was a little more confident overall and delivered a higher rate of keepers. Next for face tracking with the Sony 15 at 1.4, where the 22.5mm equivalent coverage is perfect for presenting pieces to camera, at least from a nearby tripod. As a fairly wide lens, you will need to be careful with your position to minimise distortion, but you'll have no worries over focus. But for comparison, here's the Sigma 16 at 1.4, where it's a tad less wide at an equivalent of 24mm, but still ideal for presenting pieces to camera. Indeed, for many years it was the go-to lens for Sony owners doing this kind of thing. And while third-party lenses, especially older models, can fall behind Sony's latest in terms of focusing, I'd say the Sigma and ZV-E10 are actually doing a pretty fine job here. The Sony 15 may be a tad wider than the Sigma, but it's still a bit too long for handheld vlogging at arm's length, as you can see here, and the lack of optical stabilisation means you'll need another solution to iron out any wobbles. This is way too shaky on an unstabilised body, but it does give you an idea of coverage and depth of field if you were to use a gimbal or a body with IBIS like the A6600. The ZV-E10 body that I use for testing here does however offer active steady shot, which applies digital stabilisation, albeit at the cost of a crop to the field of view. As you can see here, it can be effective at reducing shake, but the result here has become way too tight as a result. So to save you any further discomfort from viewing me at this kind of size, here's a clip from the 11mm 1.8 with active steady shot, showing it to be the preferred option for the handheld vloggers out there. Next, for focus breathing, with the 15mm manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. As the lens focuses closer, the field of view widens by a tiny fraction, but it's barely visible here, and I'd say a non-issue for general use. For comparison, here's the Sigma 16 1.4, which slightly reduces its field of view when focusing from infinity to the closest distance. It's certainly more visible than the Sony 15, but I wouldn't say deal-breakingly so. Okay, now for distortion, and like most new mirrorless lenses, especially wide ones, the 15 1.8 employs software profiles to correct for geometric distortion. Enter the lens compensation menu on the ZV-E10 here, and you'll see distortion compensation is not just set to auto on all three of Sony's new lenses by default, but it's also greyed out, meaning you can't turn it off. This means it's automatically applied to JPEGs in camera whether you like it or not, and generally applied by default when converting RAW files too. But as a brand new lens when I made this review, the profile wasn't yet available in Adobe Camera Raw, and that's allowing me to take a peek behind the curtain. Let's take a look. So here's a photo I took in RAW plus JPEG mode, starting with the RAW version without the profile, and as I toggle between it and the outer camera JPEG version, you'll see the latter correcting for some barrel distortion with a mild crop to the field of view as a result. Since the lens was designed to be only used with profiles, I'll be showing you corrected images from this point on. For my first test, I wanted to compare the coverage after profiles had been applied. So here's the Sony 15 on the left, confirming that it is indeed capturing a broader field of view than the Sigma on the right. Note that the Sigma lens also relies on profiles, so I've applied them in all of the following comparisons. So now let's angle the view so that fine details run into the corners. This is the 15mm wide open at 1.4, where it's capturing a wide field of view. I always shoot this from the same position so you can compare the coverage and quality with my other reviews. Taking a closer look in the middle of the frame shows a good degree of fine detail, with only a minor boost in contrast and sharpness when closed any further. For comparison, here's the Sony 15 on the left and the Sigma 16 on the right, both at 1.4, and while the Sigma is a little more magnified due to its slightly longer focal length, I'd say the Sony actually enjoys a lead over it in the middle wide open, at least in terms of resolved details. Heading into the far corner of the Sony 15 image at 1.4 reveals a gradual fall off in sharpness when the lens is focused in the middle of the frame. This can be improved if you were to move the focus area to the corner, but here I'm judging a full landscape image. Place the Sony 15 on the left and the Sigma 16 on the right, both again at f1.4 though, and the corner performance from the Sony is notably better. As you gradually close the aperture, both do become crisper, but the Sony stays in the lead. It's certainly delivering a sharper result across the frame at larger apertures, whereas the Sigma really does benefit more from being stopped down. Moving on to a portrait distance, here I am with the 15mm at 1.4 on the ZV-E10 again, using face and eye detection to focus, and if you keep to the middle of the frame you can mostly avoid distortion. Here's a closer look with the Sony 15 on the left and the Sigma 16 on the right, both at f1.4 with the same camera position, but I've stepped back a little bit for the Sigma to compensate somewhat for its slightly longer focal length. Now you can see straight away that the Sony 15 is crisper at 1.4 compared to the Sigma, as you'd expect for a much newer lens. Moving on to the background blur though, I'd say the Sigma is rendering slightly smoother bokeh than the Sony, which to me looks a little more attractive and suffers from less busyness. I should also mention that if you only intend to use these lenses for video or even for conference calls, then the Sigma will probably be good enough. You won't notice the difference in sharpness when you're dealing with reduced bandwidth. Next up, a closer look at rendering of bokeh balls, here with the 15mm at 1.4 and near to the minimum focusing distance of 20cm. Note, you may get a tad closer if you manually focus. As you can see, it's possible to achieve attractive background blurring effects when focused this close, and while there is some elongation towards the corners, they still look good with only subtle outlining or textures within. As the aperture is gradually closed, you'll see the blobs take on different shapes influenced by the 7 aperture blades. As another comparison, here's the 15 at 1.4 on the left, with the Sigma 16 1.4 on the right, both from near to their minimum focusing distances. Interestingly, while the Sigma won't focus quite as close as the Sony, that extra millimetre in focal length does mean the background is a little tighter, with slightly enlarged blobs as a result. Both lenses have a similar rendering style though. And at the other end of the scale, here's an example of diffraction spikes with the aperture close to the minimum of f16. Due to a slightly hazy sky on the day, I had to minimise the sun's size by obscuring it a little behind a branch. And now it's time for my final verdict, during which I'll show you some images I took with a 15-1.4 on a ZV-E10 body, and as always you can access some of the originals via my review of the lens at cameralabs.com if you'd like a closer look. The Sony E 15mm f1.4G is a very welcome addition to the company's catalogue of APS-C lenses, delivering a slightly wider than 24mm equivalent field of view coupled with a bright aperture. The G-series optics and 2022 design give it a step up in sharpness and focusing consistency over the older Sigma 16 1.4, and is also comfortably smaller and lighter. Like the Sigma though, not to mention the other two Sony lenses launched alongside it, there's no optical stabilisation, leaving you to use either a gimbal or a body with IBIS or active steady shot in order to iron out the wobbles. There's also the fact that Sigma is almost half the price, which continues to make it the ideal option for presenting to camera with a nice blurred background but without breaking the bank. And if it's mounted on a tripod, who cares if it's bigger and heavier? And let's not forget the other lenses Sony launched at the same time. The 11mm 1.8 is lighter, cheaper and much wider, making it the preferred choice for handheld vloggers or extreme wide angle fans, while the 10-20 is also lighter and trades the fast aperture for the flexibility of a zoom, and a powered one at that. But if, like me, you love the coverage of a 24 or thereabouts and you also have the budget to spend, then the Sony E 15mm f1.4G could end up becoming a favourite in your gear bag. I've also reviewed both the 11mm 1.8 and 10-20mm power zooms, so do check them out if you're interested, and don't forget to subscribe if you find any of these reviews useful. Let me know which of the three lenses is your favourite in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.